On May 8, 1929, in the city of Montclair, New Jersey, a boy is born, and he's named John. John's father was very wealthy, and the time is the 1920s, where the economy is booming. It was at a time where any American that had extra cash laying around, they would invest in the stock market, and you were told you were stupid if you didn't do so. When something like this happened in the country, a huge bubble started to form, a bubble that's about to burst. And this burst happened a few months after John was born in 1929. John's father, meaning William Yates Bogle, lost all of his life savings in one day because he had his entire life savings and his entire wealth in the stock market, and it all went to zero. This is when the Great Depression hits. There is no money, nobody has a job, nobody can even get a job, and everything is extremely expensive. Bogle's family went from a very wealthy family to an extremely poor family. John's father, that had a lot of pressure on him, turns to alcohol and becomes a raging alcoholic. You could say John had lost his father because he was forced with his two brothers to go looking for a job to provide for the family because his father wasn't doing anything but damaging the family. To say the least, John was devastated that his father was like this and he was defeated so easily. This is when he told himself that he'll never be like his father and he's not gonna make himself defeated this easily. From the age of 11, John keeps this promise and works extremely hard. Since John didn't have a true mentor, the first thing that came to his mind to be successful is make it to a good college. When finally he graduated high school, he entered one of the best schools in the world, Princeton University, and he decided to study economics. Just like everything in his life after the age of 11, he didn't want to feel defeated in anything. So when he entered the University of Princeton, the first thing he thought to himself that he will graduate in this school top of the class. You could say he saw the university like a race and he wanted to finish first place no matter what. When a few weeks passes after he started school, he realizes that he's not alone in this school and everybody in the school thinks like them and they want to finish first place at the end. But John wasn't gonna make the same mistake his father did and get defeated and stop trying. He tried even harder. When you get to the third year, John is already thinking about the thesis he wants to write, and he's thinking long and hard. He knows the thesis will be the kill shot to finish first place in this race. Finally, after researching for months, John knew what type of thesis to write. He chose mutual funds, something that was very new at this time. Mutual funds are very common nowadays, but this is the year 1950. The mutual fund basically takes people's money and invests it for other people. Since people had bad flashbacks about the market crashing in the 1930s, they only wanted to invest in the savings account of their bank, which is why John had the idea to make his paper about the mutual fund, so he can change people's mind about investments. He finally decides to write a thesis about the mutual fund, and it was so damn impressive that newspapers around the US, especially New York City, wrote about it. John Bogle graduates in the year 1951, at a time where there is only one mutual fund, Wellington, ran by Walter Morgan. And it wasn't a joke because they had $150 million of people's money in there. And this is the 1950s, so $150 million is a hefty amount. One of these days, Walter Morgan picks up the newspaper and he's confronted with John C. Bogle's thesis. The least you could say, he was impressed by the paper, where he calls his assistant over to make him hire John C. Bogle to Wellington. Morgan really liked John C. Bogle's style because he didn't want to put 100% of his money into stocks. He would put about half of it into stocks and the other half in bonds. John C. Bogle entered the company at a very bad time because when he entered, different mutual funds were forming all around the country, and this meant more competition for Wellington. So a lot of people were pulling their money out of Wellington and going to different mutual funds. which is why Wellington started to struggle. But this wasn't something that would let John C. Bogle down, because he liked the challenge. He immediately started to think of a way on how to save the company and not let it lose so much money. The first idea that popped into his head was genius, because he made a portfolio of different stocks that were extremely stable and they were always rising a few percent every year. He wanted to invest in companies that were very stable and they weren't all over the place. At this time, Morgan is looking into retirement, which is why he needed a replacement. He already found the best replacement in his opinion, and he made John C. Bogle the replacement for the CEO of Wellington. But it seems like Wellington was still struggling. This was at a time in the 1960s where a lot of people started to invest their own money by themselves and they didn't trust any mutual funds. This was kind of like the 1920s where the bubble was starting to form, but not as big. So John had a lot of responsibility at this time because he was the one that had to choose on what to do to save the company. He only had one method, and that's to make a partner to Wellington. After investigating and trying to make partners with other companies to not go bankrupt, a lot of them denied his request. So he was forced to go to a smaller bank in Boston, Massachusetts, a bank called iVest. Even though they only had $17 million in their hands, but they seemed like they were successful and they knew what they were doing, which is why John C. Bogle made a deal with them. After making a deal, it seems like John made a huge mistake, because this is how they shared the company: 60% Wellington and 40% iVest, even though they were much smaller than Wellington, which is why all the investors and the top people of Wellington didn't like this idea and they were giving iVest too much power. When these two companies joined together, the name changed to Wellington Management. It started to grow rapidly and they were doing very well, until John C. Bogle suffered a heart attack. After suffering a heart attack, the management team decided that they have to replace John as CEO. But from the hospital, John told them that I'll be right back, don't replace me. And he came back in a few weeks and ran the company and made it better and better. But that's until we get to 1973, where the stock market crashes once again and Wellington starts to struggle. So John C. Bogle had a lot on his plate on how to save the company once again. This is when the management team decided that they should fire John C. Bogle because they put 100% of the blame on John C. Bogle. When they told John that you need to be replaced and they forced him to resign, he said absolutely not, and if you force me, I will fight to the day I die. Since they didn't want to damage the management anymore, they decided to make him a manager rather than the CEO, which he accepted. But John C. Bogle didn't like this because it's like going from president to vice president and you don't have any true power anymore in the company. But that's when he went to the rule book and he read every rule that's written in this company's history. And after a few weeks, he found a few loopholes. One of the loopholes is that the management that he had control over could use people's money and invest them in different places. He also could change the name of the company, which is why he changed them from Wellington Management to Vanguard. Another idea popped into John C. Bogle's head. He wanted to change Vanguard from a mutual fund to an index fund. It's interesting to note that John Bogle was the first person to create an index fund, which is Vanguard. The idea of an index fund changed Wall Street forever, and the idea made Vanguard much more famous than it ever was. A lot of people do not like change, and when there's change, they get nervous and stop investing, which is what happened exactly to Vanguard. Even in different newspapers, it said, if you spend money or invest your money into an index fund, you are an idiot because you're for sure gonna lose it. But John C. Bogle was very confident in this idea and he thought it was the best, which is how he convinced people to keep their money. Even though a lot of people took their money out of Vanguard, but a lot of people stayed as well. And that paid off 7 years later. This is when all of Vanguard's enemies were hating him because he was surpassing all of them. People were taking their money out of mutual funds all around the country and investing it in the only index fund, Vanguard. So the money Vanguard controlled would get bigger and they would get skinnier. In the year 1996, Vanguard changed the entirety of Wall Street, and he did something that you couldn't play like you did with stocks anymore. And it was at this time the companies that hated Vanguard were starting to copy his idea. But the more you move forward, the bigger Vanguard gets and the smaller the other ones get. Vanguard starts to exponentially grow, and when you get to the year 2019, Vanguard is controlling $5 trillion. That's an absurd amount of money. That's 5 with 12 zeros in front of it. If you want to get a better perspective, the US government has a $5 trillion budget per year. But this was 2019. That means 4 to 5 years ago. How much money do they have in their hands now? $8 trillion. And every day this amount is growing. A lot of people say that BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street are so goddamn wealthy that they own the world. They invest in all the biggest companies around the world. They have the highest shareholdings. And worst of all, they buy land everywhere where they raise housing prices, property prices, and the cost of rent. Either way, they're making a whole lot of money from rent or buying the property as investments.